After months of careful preparation and primping, the clown costume is now officially complete. First, we applied the foundational makeup of denial. The fundamentals of our economy are strong. And then, the details of denial, that we're not in recession because the 2/4 of GDP decline is only one overly simplistic and antiquated measure. Then, the wig of redefinition. Actually, a recession is so complicated to identify and measure that only the experts could ever declare it. And now we have finally arrived. The bright red nose of acceptance. Yes, recession is here, but that's a good thing, or at least partially a good thing. Hey, don't get down about the down economy, or you'll miss out on all the silver linings. This from the Washington Post on Wednesday: 7 ways a recession could be good for you financially, which is sort of like discussing the benefits of smoking a pack of cigarettes while eating a banana for breakfast every morning. Yeah, you will get some healthy potassium, but there are some overwhelming costs that are wiser to consider. And in this case, many of these supposed benefits aren't even attainable anyway. Well, hey, good news. The value of your home is going to drop. But if you're a buyer, that's good news, the Post says, even though the rising interest rates will cancel out any home buying savings you would have had anyway. Good news, the trade-in value of your car is up, so you can trade it in for another overpriced used car because there are no new cars on the lot. Good news, the dollar is doing comparatively well internationally, so enjoy all the savings on your European vacation that you can't afford to take anyway. And even if you don't have the money for that vacation, just take it anyway because yes, good news, once you're back, Joe Biden will have canceled all your student debt. So go ahead and replace that irresponsible debt with another irresponsible debt. Because after all, as the Post advises, fear will not help you make wise financial decisions. As though there was ever any wisdom in a 6-figure debt for a gender studies degree. As though there is any wisdom in saddling that debt to the productive tax-paying citizen who actually was wise enough to avoid such foolishness in the first place. And as though there's any wisdom in believing that at $300+ billion minimum, as one of these new lawsuits describes, the single most expensive stroke of an executive pen in the history of the country, that this move will bring any sort of relief to the inflationary pressures cursing this economy. It's been over a month since Biden announced the plan, student debt cancellation of up to $20,000 per borrower, depending on income and Pell Grant circumstances, but to date, very little detail has been offered. On Thursday, the Department of Education sent an email to those who requested updates on the plan, announcing that possibly within days in October, there will be a short online application. You don't even need to provide any supporting detail or even prove who you are. Just fill out the form, they'll review it, and they'll work with your loan processor to handle your debt cancellation, assuming your eligibility. And as even CNN acknowledges in their reporting, there is still a lack of specifics. At what time is all this happening? To be determined. They'll let you know, so just hang tight and wait for them to get back to you. Until looking into these new legal challenges, I had assumed that lack of specifics was just the product of a hasty policy. This is a midterm Hail Mary. It's just a desperate, rotting bone thrown to their rabid voter base to try to salvage whatever they can out of what is all but assured to be a bad November day for Democrats. So the lack of specifics was simply because the policy was being invented in a hurry. They don't know what they plan because they haven't had the time to plan. That's what I thought. But as these lawsuits were filed this week to challenge the debt cancellation, I don't think that's right. I don't think the lack of detail is the product of haste or incompetence. Like everything else, it's the product of a strategy. And I feel a little dumb for not seeing that from the start. As with all of these policies, when you stop assuming accident and you start assuming intent, a lot more starts to make sense. What I mean is that what isn't specified isn't challengeable in court, or at least not easily, and there's a legal advantage in that. As we'll get to, I have little doubt that Biden's debt cancellation plan is flatly illegal, as these lawsuits explain. But without the specifics of the plan available, the lawsuits have a tougher path to those challenges, and the courts have a tougher time considering them. So don't bother saying what you're doing, just do it, and then when the lawsuits come later, it'll be too late, because it's already done. I think that's what we're watching here. And these lawsuits provide good evidence for it. But first, let's get to the details of these suits. This week, there were 3 of them filed. The first suit comes from a libertarian-aligned legal foundation in Indiana, alleging that some of these borrowers will actually be hurt by this debt cancellation in some states because these states count the canceled debt as income, thus creating a tax liability. A second suit comes from the attorneys general in 6 states, alleging that the loan processors in these states are harmed because the debt cancellation will deprive them of revenue that they're owed. And the third suit comes from the attorney general of Arizona, alleging that his state will be harmed in a series of ways economically by the cancellation of the debt. And all that posturing for who will be harmed and how and why is the second difficulty in challenging Biden's move. For a lawsuit to be considered, those bringing it need standing. They need sufficient connection to and harm from the law, or in this case, the executive action. And with a move this broad, getting that specific is challenging to do because even though the taxpayer is getting railroaded by this policy without due process of law in general, simply being a taxpayer is not sufficient to demonstrate standing. The Supreme Court has already established. And so you have all the people bringing these suits jockeying to establish some connection to a harm outside of the general abuse of the public at large and the circumvention of the constitutionally required legal process, which personally I find very frustrating. When the federal government violates constitutional boundaries by acting outside the process for creating new law, which in my opinion it very clearly is doing here, we are all harmed. Any citizen should have standing in that scenario because as citizens, we are all guaranteed our rights and our property unless and until due process is served. And due process is not served when the president makes things up without legal authorization. You are harmed by that. I am harmed by that. We are all harmed by that. No special demonstration should be necessary to challenge that abuse in court. But at least as far as I understand, the courts disagree, and a more specific personal harm must be demonstrated, and thus the challenge of challenging this debt cancellation. Without the necessary specifics, you can't show a personal harm, and you can't make the technical legal arguments. There is evidence that the White House knows this and is using that as a deliberate legal strategy. More on that in a minute. Without the specifics, these lawsuits are left to argue the general based on what we do know. For a president to act constitutionally, he needs one of 2 things: either Article 2 authorization or authorization by law from Congress. And clearly, Article 2 of the Constitution authorizes none of this. Not even in the emanations or the penumbras can you find a presidential authority to cancel debt on a whim, which means the president needs a law to authorize his action. And that's what Biden is arguing. The White House is claiming the authority to make this move under the HEROES Act of 2002, a post-9/11 law that authorized the Department of Education to grant student loan waivers or modifications primarily to active duty military serving in war. Think Afghanistan and Iraq at the time it was extended and later made permanent. The idea being that if you had student debt and you were serving in the military, the Department of Education would make accommodations to ensure that you didn't unfairly fall behind on that debt as a result of your military service. And if it seems like a stretch to say that a law that was written for soldiers during wartime somehow actually applies to everyone all the time, well, that's because it is. But in fairness to that interpretation, the law does also allow for loan modification for those experiencing economic hardship as a result of a national emergency. It's under that language that Biden is operating, but still, the HEROES Act has several stipulations about who qualifies and how and why. It has never been applied in the way it's now being applied, and those factors are the basis on which these lawsuits challenge. Firstly, it's not at all clear that the necessary emergency was ever established at all, or even if it was, that it still currently exists, partly because the president himself says the emergency is over.
Is the pandemic over?
The pandemic is over. If you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape.
But even if that was a misspeak, the HEROES Act still requires some definition to that term, emergency. The law says an emergency in this context refers to an area that is declared a disaster by government officials or to economic hardship as determined by the Education Secretary. But that's our second problem. The Secretary of Education made no such distinction. The emergency is everywhere, and the economic hardship is everybody. below a certain income. But there is no distinction made as to whether those eligible for debt cancellation are in better or worse financial condition than they were before the virus in late 2019, early 2020. The law requires a demonstrated economic harm. Biden makes no evaluation of that harm. So we don't have the emergency that the law requires. We don't have the harm that the law requires. And thirdly, we don't have the solution that the law requires either. The HEROES Act was not written for blanket debt cancellation. It was written to return borrowers back to the status they had before the harm was done. Erase the harm, not the debt entirely. That was the idea, and we've already done that. No borrower was harmed during the pandemic because we already paused their payments. We paused the accrual of their interest as well. And through inflation, the real dollar value of what they owe has now actually decreased. If mitigating the harm is what the law allows, that is done. In fact, as the 6-state lawsuit complaint notes, 80% of student loan borrowers saw their credit scores increase as a result of these moves. The harm has already been erased, and no more is authorized by the HEROES Act, if it even applies at all. And of course, there's the obvious broader legal problem here. If Congress intended to write a law for blanket debt cancellation under an arbitrary income threshold, Congress could have done that, but they did not. Instead, they wrote a law with all sorts of specific terms and conditions. And if the president doing this himself has actually been legal the whole time, why did Democrats waste so much time proposing failed bill after failed bill, only to suddenly realize that, hey, no such bill is necessary. The law they wanted was already on the books. If this is legal, why did Nancy Pelosi disagree little more than a year ago?
People think that the President of the United States has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. That has to be an act of Congress.
They knew it was legally dubious, but they had no other way, and so they did it anyway. And it's no leap to say that they're intentionally covering their legal tracks with ambiguity while they do it. As I said, you cannot challenge what you don't know. And so the White House is just making it up as they go to blow up those challenges along the way. That first lawsuit from the Indiana Legal Foundation was immediately dismissed pending an amended complaint. Why? Because there's no harm in the form of a tax liability if the borrower can simply opt out of the debt forgiveness. And when was that opt-out announced? Right after that lawsuit was filed. Just 2 days later, in fact, according to the Arizona Attorney General, this new opt-out feature was done to defeat that lawsuit's standing and evade the legal challenge. The second lawsuit from the 6 states claims legal standing on the basis that their loan servicers will suffer financial damage from this debt cancellation. So what did Biden do? The very same day that suit was filed, he just changed some of the financial terms so that claim of legal standing would no longer apply. Again, erasing the standing in this case and avoiding the legal challenge, or at least that's the attempt. It's just running out the clock. You can't challenge what isn't specified. So you say nothing and you just do it. And by the time the legal system catches up to you, it's too late because it's already done. And it's not like you're going to put those borrowers back on the hook for the debt that's already been declared void, because that would bring its own legal problems. And besides, it's not like there's any sort of punishment for this illegality after the fact anyhow. The courts will just say, hey, stop it, if they say anything at all. And Biden will say, yeah, I already did. I stopped it. It's in the past. And the punishment will just be a tisk-tisk and a furrowed brow instead of the spontaneous Big Bird costume that this sort of behavior used to rightly earn. How do we know that'll happen? Because it already has. They did it with the illegal and unconstitutional eviction moratorium already. The Supreme Court warned Biden, you don't have the legal authority to do that. He acknowledged that he didn't. And then he did it anyway. When they finally told him to stop it, it was too late because it was already done. And he remained featherless for that one too. That is the strategy. Say nothing, just do it, and there won't be any consequences later because by then it's already done and there's really no undoing. And then repeat. It is exactly the sort of made up, arbitrary, lawless governance that the Constitution is designed to protect against happening repeatedly right in front of us because the Constitution counted on us actually having the balls to stop it when it did. Either that or Biden knows that this is illegal and he knows that he'll lose in court, but he's just buying the time to scrape your votes for the midterm only to say afterward, whoops, Turns out I can't do that. Sorry, gotcha. Either way, he is fucking around betting that he won't find out in total defiance of the charts.
See, as you can see, the more you fuck around, the more you're going to find out. And also, if you stay down here and you never fuck around, you'll never find out. So I hope this lesson is helpful. Thank you.
So we'll see if the science actually prevails as advertised. Electorally, Susan, thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Minds. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.